Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many of you. And we're particularly grateful for Moshé to do this and today, because yesterday he tested positive for COVID. He's not feeling too bad, but he does have some symptoms. So please excuse anything which is perhaps less fluent than it might have been otherwise. But we're delighted that he's making the effort still to talk to us. His background is deeply into wine of Israel, from the time when he worked in his father's wine shop in Israel as a very young man. Once in the UK, he worked selling German wines, established his own wine merchant, then took time out to study physiotherapy. That's a long story, which we won't go into now. But he's back now in the wine trade, or wine communication trade, with his podcast in the vineyard. And he's just completing his WSCT diploma. So Moshé, over to you. Tell us all about the wine of Israel.
Thank you. Yes, I just apologize if it's not, sorry. There you go. It started already the wrong way, but yeah, if I choke all of a sudden or cough, please forgive me. I'll do my best not to. One positive is the fact that normally people that know me would know that I talk way too much. So today I'll try to be economical with how much I say about each of the slides. So thank you for coming to this presentation and taking the time. I think for most of you, if I guess, Israeli wine would be a new subject. I wanted to run a poll, but yeah, from those of you that can see, you can nod, or if you tell me if you ever had Israeli wine or if you ever visited Israel. So I see some no's, yes. So the title that I wanted to give this presentation, From Kosher to Terroir, is because a lot of people associate the wines of Israel with kosher wine. For years, for decades, Israeli wines was available abroad, mainly on the kosher shelves or in Jewish delis, etc. And I think it's gone, it's come a long way in the last 20, 30 years, and establishing itself as a small country that discover its own strengths. And terroir is one thing, where I think now the drive to find terroir is such that, again, it led me to choose this photograph, because this is actually a vineyard that you can see here in the desert, in the south of Israel. We will talk about the desert later, but in search of new territories or specific terroir, winemakers now venture into the desert and plant vineyards where some of them thought there were no vineyards before, but as again we will see later, there were vineyards, there was agriculture in this area many, many years ago. So it's a challenge to try to talk about Israel in 45 minutes, in Israeli wine in 45 minutes. And it's tempting to go back in history and talk about ancient times, because we like to refer to Israel as the ancient world. It's not old world, it's not new world, it's the ancient world of wine. But, and I could have concentrated a big part of this on the fascinating area of Israel, or the area wine production from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Recently, there was excavation, archaeological excavation that discovered a Byzantine winery from about 1,500 years ago, almost complete. An amazing visit that will be when it will be open for the public, with capacity to make 2 million bottles. That's, again, something that is very exciting. But I will talk about the last 150 years very briefly, and very swiftly move to nowadays. So here's the, by the way, if you want to drag the gallery, because it's probably most of you, the gallery is now condensed to the right side of the screen. Feel free to drag it because it's right on a map. But this is a map, a wine map of Israel. And the different zones that you can see there. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but that's the north with the Golan here, the Galilee that is divided now to different sub-regions. And I put some key statistics here on the map. The area planted is 5,500 hectares, which incidentally is about the size of, to compare, it's the size of the Medoc AOC in Bordeaux. So it's not very large. Production is about 450,000 hectoliters. Somebody need to mute, please. Yeah. And varieties, main varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Syrah, Carignan, Petit Syrah. You can see the list there. And the whites are still Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Viognier, Colombat, and so on. And some local varieties that I'll touch on. It's tempting to go into it in more detail, but I'll have to just touch on the local varieties. Export is about 20% of the production, and mainly it's to US, France, and UK. So again, that's the East Mediterranean here. The area that we're going to talk, again, Israel is very varied in way of climate. The north is, as you're going to see in a minute, it can be cold, snowy. It's high hills from the coast here. It rises very quickly to 7, 8, even 1,000 meters above sea level here. And here in the Golan, there's a mountain here on the north called Mount Hermon that is, the peak is 2,800 meters above sea level. But the vineyards here are around from 500 to 1,200 meters. The central areas are, again, Mediterranean with some continental climate or semi-continental that can, in some sub-regions. And the desert that will form part of this presentation is anywhere from south. That's the Dead Sea here. And the Negev is a big area, but that's the planted area is pretty small, as you can see. So let's delve back to history. Recent history. In 1882, Baron Edmund de Rothschild, and you can see behind the Chateau Lafite Rothschild, decided to send some experts to some of his agronomists to survey the land and to see what Palestine can produce. They came back with a recommendation to plant near the coast, near Mount Carmel, which is, if those of you familiar with the port city of Haifa, it's just south of Haifa. There's a hill or mountain that is like a ridge. And they decided the best place to plant grapes was there, mainly Rhone varieties with some Alicante Boucher. And the production here, I've got a few photos of the tonnellerie that they spared no cost. So including training, staff for cooperage, you can see here. And they established 2 wineries, one in Zichron, Yaacov, which is in the Carmel Mountain, and one in Rishon LeZion, that is south of nowadays Tel Aviv. And I have to say that there were wineries prior to these 2, but again, this is the watershed kind of moment in the local industry, knowing that with the investment of the Baron and the expert that he sent, everything moved to a different scale. This is one of the 2 wineries, and I remember visiting there in the late 70s as a schoolboy, and what hit me was the smell, because a lot of the sacramental wine that were produced, or what we call kosher wine, gave a really strong kind of porty smell, and I still remember it. It's like many years ago, but the visit to this old winery that was there until the 80s, actually, with this big vats here on the left, was something that will stay with me probably forever. So again, that's what it looked inside. I'm not going to spend a lot of time into kosher wine. Probably in the questions at the end, I'm sure somebody will want to know what makes wine kosher. It's quite, it's not complicated, but it's something that I want to touch on very briefly. So here are some labels of wines that probably the UK members here will remember, they're still on sale. Palwyn, which is short for Palestine wine. And these were sweet red wines. And I found a photo, the bottom one is actually called Chateau Windsor, in 1965, with a screw top, which is way ahead of its time. And yeah, so these wines were pretty basic. They were sweetened with grape sugars, and they were for sacramental use. But when I was a kid in the 70s, pretty much that was it. Later on, we thought things got sophisticated when we got some Emerald Riesling, medium sweet wines, and some Chardonnays. But it wasn't until far later, here in the early 80s, I call it the new era. Golan Heights, this photo is from the north part of the Golan Heights. It's a very old fort overlooking the valley of Hula, and far on the ridge ahead is the Upper Galilee. In fact, far to the right is already Lebanon. I was born right there near this the water reservoirs that you can see in the valley. And the Golan Heights was identified in the early 80s as an area where there's, because of the elevation, there's potential for quality grapes, and with investment that came from within and some knowledge from California, vineyards were planted. So the Golan Heights winery was the first, here it is on the right, the serious investment in the planting vineyards in the Golan Heights. The vineyards that they planted were quite high. Now there's vineyards in the lower part of the Golan Heights that is slightly lower, but here you can see vineyards that are about 900 meters above sea level. The mountain that you see in the background is the Mount Hermon, and that is that peak in the middle is about 2,300 meters. There are no vineyards there, but it's an army post that you can see on top. But yeah, so the vineyards proved very successful. Cabernet Sauvignon Merlot of really very quickly got in 83 was the first release, was well received internally and internationally, lots of medals and lots of accolades. And the that was for a few years the kind of pioneer winery that everybody, that pulled the whole industry forward. So the Golan Heights, high elevation vineyards, it's a high plateau and it's volcanic. The mountains you see there in the background are extinct volcanoes. Some of them now in the volcano craters have vineyards planted. There used to be a lot of apples grown there. Still, there are a lot of apples. It's a bit like Elgin in South Africa. Apples go well, then come a winemaker and plant a vineyard instead. So they, yeah, so it's cool. I won't give you all the difference between the coast and the high elevation in temperatures, but it's for Israel, it's cool. And here it is in winter. So in winter, you have snow pretty much every year. There was snow the last week. And the vineyards get very good dormant period. And yeah, so the next area I want to move to is the Judean Hills. So feel free, I know it's flying through the country, but feel free to ask later anything to do with the north, because I know it was very brief. But here in the Judean Hills, closer to Jerusalem, we refer to that area as the foothills, Judean foothills and Judean Hills. And very recently, 2-3 years ago, an area within Judean Hills was isolated as a PDO, which is actually the country's first PDO. The vineyard in the photo is the Shoresh vineyard of Terroir winery, if any of you heard of Terroir. I'll touch on it in a minute. And these hills are, again, not dissimilar to the Galilee, because they also limestone. There's a lot of fossilized fossils in the ground. And with vineyards being planted there for many years, but in the last 20, 30 years, there's a lot of concentration on specific terroir and what can grow best where. And again, it's not all about elevation. Some of the vineyards are actually taking advantage of creeks and lower parts within the hills. And it's very interesting. I'll touch on that when I show you the main protagonists in a minute. Sorry. A little bit of energy drink. Sorry, I'm not, my plan was to sit with a glass of wine, and it was supposed to be somewhere completely different, but no wine for me today. So, yeah, I thought we'll talk about, a little bit about the native grapes. So the native grapes that really 30, 40 years ago, nobody thought of, or nobody paid attention, nobody knew they existed. Just as a brief highlight to you, Israel, or the land of Palestine, was under Ottoman rule for 400 years until 1917. The common belief or misconception is that the Ottomans, because of Islam, did not allow wine to be made. It's not exactly true. The proof for that is Greece, that was under Ottoman rule, most of it, but kept the vineyards and kept wine production. The Ottomans were not really concerned with wine for sacramental use. The problem that Israel had is that a lot of the population did not make wine for sacramental use, and being of Muslim majority, these grapes that you see here, the Buki, Hamdani, Jandali, Bituni, Marawi, and a few others, all existed, but existed on a tiny scale. And in the last 10 or so years, there's a lot of research into identifying grapes that by DNA that are unique to the region, isolating them and try to propagate them and to make wines out of them. The results are good. There are some winemakers in the country that specialize in one or two or all of them. And the results are good. It's just the jury is still out whether the quality will justify more planting. Israel has, as you've seen, very small planted area. So to decide that, for instance, Bituni is the next big thing, and to plant another 200 or 300 hectares is a big decision. So the jury is still out on quality level. Yeah, so research is done. The Palestinian population grew them. Some of them were just on a tiny scale. And it's worth mentioning a monastery of Kremizan that is near Bethlehem, that grew them for forever to make wine since the late 19th century, and was run into disrepair. And some of you will know this story, some not, but it was Riccardo Cottarella, the famous Italian oenologist that visited Israel on a pilgrimage, that got to see the winery in a very bad state, and decided to, with some friends in Italy, to train two local young men to become winemakers in Italy. Equipment was donated, and now Kremizan is making excellent wines. And the same time, Israeli wineries are again experimenting with these varieties. I thought I'd be brief, and I wasn't, so there you go, sorry. And there's another grape variety that is unique to Israel, Argaman, which is a cross developed in Israel. It's a Carignan cross with Sozao from Portugal. The idea was Israeli wines in the 70s, 60s, 70s were losing color, oxidizing very quickly. There was a problem with color. Carignan grew to incredible yields that were giving very pale wines. So Sauzao is very strong colored red grape or black grape. And the idea was to get this color of Sauzao with the yield of Carignan. For years, because it was developed in 1972, for years it was used mainly in blends. And recently, and the reason I gave it a whole slide on its own is because I believe that this variety can get some traction, because for years it was, again, not really winning many friends in winemakers. It was mainly a blend component, but I want to talk about Ido Levinson, Israel's latest MW. We have two. Ido Levinson is the head winemaker in Baakan, which is the country's biggest winery, and for Segal. And on the right, you can see, again, if you dragged, I'll do it myself, drag the gallery to one side. So the wine that he makes almost exclusively for the UK market, Levant Argaman, that is 2020, and it's taken by Liberty. So Liberty are marketing it. And again, to give you an idea of what Argaman is like, it could be, as it was in the 70s and 80s, pretty terrible, tannic or unbalanced. And I spoke to Ido about a week ago just to talk, to sharpen my understanding of his latest Argaman. And he was so excited by what's in barrels at the moment. He said, and he trained in Italy, by the way, in Piemonte. He said, imagine the Terroir de of Elisabetta Foradori. Light tannin, really nice acidity, great cranberry, cherry. So that's a big comparison. Foradori Terroir de is a wine with good international name. So I think it's not far from the mark. It's excellent wine, and I think Argaman can get somewhere if there's enough plantation. The planted area is about 240 hectares, which again is tiny, and Ido has control over just over 30% of that. So he's excited, and he wants to, in the next few years, experiment a little bit more with different locations, different elevations, and different viticulture practices. So yeah, I said we'll talk a little bit about the desert. Don't worry, we'll come back in a bit to the Judean hills and other areas. But I want to talk about the Negev, which is the desert. That's the name of the biggest desert in Israel. And here's a quote from Israel's iconic first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. It is in the Negev that the creativity and pioneer vigor of Israel shall be tested. And Ben-Gurion was a big advocate for, he actually left Tel Aviv and moved to live in the Negev desert to show example. He believed there's a massive potential there. And in recent years, very recent, again, winemakers took that challenge and moved there to plant vineyards. So yeah, there's a real world innovation in desert agriculture. The vineyard we've seen before here, in the Tzin Valley, it's a vineyard planted by Carmel of Dat, which is a very small winery. And Eran Raz, known as Nana, from the Nana winery, with his vineyard. And it's not just drip irrigation, it's knowing how to, by the way, talking about the desert, people think it's all hot desert like the Sahara. It's this fantastic day-night diurnal range temperature differentials. So it's often, not every year, but it sometimes snows, it frosts in the desert. And it's just knowing when to harvest, what to grow, and of course, how to vinify it there. is the biggest challenge. So the soils are very uniform. It's mainly loess. Here I chose a photo of saying before, earlier in the presentation, I was saying that people thought nothing was grown there ever, but here you go. This photo from about 20 years ago on top is an aerial photo of showing Nabatean, which is ancient culture. There were desert nomads that built some cities in the desert. They benefited from the fact that desert, the Negev, is on the spice route, and they grew not just vineyards, but all sorts of agriculture on terraces there that you can see the lines, mainly to trade with passing traders. I read somewhere recently that it was actually a plague and climate change that wiped them out. I think it's Adam, I have to give you credit for that. And it was, and here we are today talking about the same issues. And that piece of land where you see the old Nabatean terraces, it's exactly the same piece of land that you can see at the bottom of Carmel of that in 2021, and a very nice green vineyard. Of course, it goes without saying, irrigation there is vital. We're talking about a desert that has some areas of the Negev as little as 80 millimeters a year. Nowhere within the desert gets more than 150 millimeters per year. It's obviously not enough. Here's the Nana winery that I mentioned before. A lot of the wineries in the desert have really lovely areas for you to come and sit in or out for to taste wine. They're very good. The 20 or so wineries in the Negev at hospitality, and the weather, even in winter, is obviously once the night chill has lifted, is lovely to sit outside. It's 320 days of sun a year. So a bit like, I suppose, you know, you can compare it maybe to Swartland. You have a really nice place, very dry air. It's low humidity, so it's really nice. And obviously because of COVID, it's mainly internal tourism, but it's growing with popular tours. Even tourists that come to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem will take a day or two to go to the desert. There are lots of activities in a way of mountain bikes and horse riding and quad bikes, exploration of the desert. And there's a lot of other things to explore with excavations of, again, Nabatean places and the King Solomon mines and things like that on the way to Elat on the Red Sea. Here it is, agriturismo in the desert, which is developing. And I wanted to touch a little bit about the main protagonist. So going back to the Judean Hills, it's also home, not just for the first PDO, but also for a collaboration between 4 wineries, which is pretty new in Israel. There were all sorts of attempts, but the Judean Hill Quartet is a collaboration that is, if I'm correct, is about 10 years old. And it's 4 wineries that's seen as very well-established wineries within Israel. On the top left is Sfera, it's Doron and Sima Rav Hon. I like to think of them as the Chris and Suzanne Alheit of Israel, those of you familiar with South Africa, specializing just in white wines. Doron studied winemaking in Burgundy and did a period of work in Jacques Breuer. He worked in Champagne, he worked in Chablis. Very passionate man about white wines. And you taste his wine and you think, well, that's never from a hot country like Israel. His white wines are superb. And when I said before about high elevation for the Judean Hills, he's a good example of somebody that took advantage actually of nooks and creeks in lower valleys, because he believes that the cold air at night that goes there benefits more than the planting at 900 meters above sea level. So a lot of his vineyards are at 300 or 400 meters, but he likes these kind of low areas where the night temperature goes down. He told me a couple of weeks ago that he recorded -4 and one night of -6 2 weeks ago. Yes, so that's a white wine specialist. In the middle is Israel's first MW. It's Eran Peak, the winemaker and general manager of the Terroir vineyards. And again, making excellent terroir wines. He is a real student of terroir and gets a lot. You can talk to him for hours about his fossils and the different elevations. We saw Shoresh vineyard, very impressive vineyards, the way he plants his vineyard. And a must, I think, stop if any of you visit Israel to visit Terroir vineyard. On the right is Eli Ben Zaken and his kids, and or children, I should say, not kids, but now they're running the winery. Eli Ben Zaken is, again, a restaurateur that turned into wine in the late 80s, and is now, the domain is called Domaine du Castel, and he's a Bordeaux man through and through. The main wine is a Bordeaux blend, but he now started under a different label, different winery, to make Rhone blends and even a sparkling wine that I'm sure will win some awards. Again, they're all in the Judean Hills, and they shout they are the ambassadors of the Judean Hills. Below is Golan Flam from Flam Winery, and they are that completes the quartet. And I think within Israel, it's seen as they seem as the kind of the establishment that led the way in many years. Sfera is quite new, but Domaine du Castel and Terroir are from the early 90s, and they do things, and the way they got their education, again, around Peak in Davis, the Sfera is Bourgogne, and Flam, again, both brothers studied in Italy. So they brought a lot of knowledge with them and a lot of ideas. As opposed to what I call the artisans, here I could have put probably 20 artisans here on this slide, but some that are close to my heart. A good friend of mine there looking at the skies is Zev Dunia from Seahorse Winery. If you ever visited, he's also in the Jerusalem Hills. If you ever visit Zev, don't ask him why Seahorse, because that's something that he's sick of answering. He's answering just because we like seahorses. It's nowhere near the sea. And here you get more of an idea of because in Israel, we don't have second, third, fourth generation winemakers like in France or in Italy. These people all have careers before. Zev is a film director and a cinema lecturer that about 25 years ago decided to quit it all, buy land in the Jerusalem Hills and plant, and he's a big lover of Rhone varieties. He also grows Infandel, but he's, again, it's mainly the Rhone varieties that he's specialized, and his wines are absolutely wonderful. I did mean to mention before about Sfera. All these wines get really good reviews, but before, when I mentioned Sfera, I can, very proudly, I can say that on John C. Robinson's review, Sfera got nothing less than 16.5, and one wine got 18 points. But all the wines I mentioned so far getting excellent reviews. And below it's Chai Wortman with his head torch. Chai Wortman from the Carmel, the Shfeya Valley in the South Carmel Mountain. Sauvignon Blanc specialist, but grows some excellent reds. And again, Terroir is a computer science man prior that about 15 years ago decided again to grow grapes and make very serious wines, now very good, but again, boutique winery. And Rami Bar Maor on the left in his vineyard, also in the Shfeya Valley near Wortman. And minimal. All of them are pretty, I call them the terroirists, but Bar Maor is a very, very minimal. It doesn't even press his grapes. It just uses first free run and ambient yeasts, and which is something that Zev, the in Seahorse, experiment now for about 7 or 8 years, very successfully. He likes to compare his wines between ones fermented with and ones with cultured, and one's the same wine with ambient. But for Rami, is only ambient yeasts. He likes to shout the Renzina, he call it the Renzina terroir of the vineyards where he grows his grapes. And yeah, I didn't mention, he was a very successful architect that quit everything and bought a small piece of land and makes wine in a very cramped, little tiny winery in actually an industrial estate, but the wines are excellent. So that is basically it. any questions? I probably left a lot to still fill, a lot of holes. So feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Moshé. I think you've given everybody, a number of people attending today, a first introduction to the wines of Israel. And a number of you, I know there's been comments in the chat about people that have tasted the wines before and drink them regularly, etc., and know the winery. So there are a few questions here, Moshé. If I can introduce them, I may ask some of the people who've put them through to ask you themselves. Lots of hellos. Shalom from Veris, Malcolm Franks, and Winnie. And Winnie says she has something in common with you. She's also a physiotherapist. Neil Hawko has visited there as well. And Kathy Burke has done a tasting of Israeli wines 15 years ago. Timo's visited Israel and is going there in the autumn with Yaacov Cohen, who's also a Circle member. Neil Hawko from the west coast of the States has asked if you can explain the alternative method of koshering wine that allows non-observant Jews to make it.
For non-Jews to make kosher wine, I'm probably going to give you the usual thing that I'll have to refer back to you because I'm not sure that it's possible. But if somebody is asking, they've probably done a bit of research and there is a method of doing it, not known to me. As far as I know, for kosher wine to be given the stamp of approval, observing Jews have to handle the wine and all the tools and touch the barrels. And there are, again, I'm looking for Adam here. Maybe Adam can contribute something. Unmute yourself.
Why do you always give me the difficult questions to answer?
Because you'll know the answer.
Basically, there are just two things that have to be done to make a wine kosher. Firstly, all the people handling the plant and machinery have to be religious Jews. And there can be no unkosher unkosher ingredients used in the winemaking. That it's as simple as that. The kosher wine is made exactly the same way as a non-kosher wine. So to give you an example, isinglass, which could be used to make it drop bright like they use for beer, couldn't be used because it comes from a sturgeon fish that's non-kosher. However, there is a movement in Israel called Soar, which is Orthodox Jews who have just started giving a kosher certificate for Israeli wineries, where they observe all the rules, and there's also agricultural rules that I won't go into. But the people that handle the plant and machinery are Jewish and not religious Jews. And there's a very good historical basis for this. The most famous person that ever worked in an Israeli winery was David Ben-Gurion. When he first came to Israel, he worked in a winery at Rishon LeZion, and he worked in the wine department, and he was not religious Jew, and he made the wine at Carmel, and no one shouted or said it's the wine's not kosher because of it. So it's an area of a lot of debate in Israel, but generally winemaking has to be Sabbath observing people touching the plant and machinery and the grapes once they arrive, which is the opposite to kosher food. In kosher food, it's based on the source of the food, but the chef might not be Jewish, but the source of the food has to be, you're not allowed to eat pig, you're not allowed to eat shellfish, you're not allowed to mix milk and meat. So there's rules, but the person that makes the food doesn't have to be Jewish. In wine, it's the opposite. It's not the ingredients, it's the base. It's based on the handler. So the handler has to be Sabbath observant, but it is a matter of debate at the moment. And there's very few small wineries that have been given the approval with this Terroir, which is quite interesting from our point of view. But who wants to enter religion? It's too complicated, very difficult to explain. And I've probably confused you all. So I'm not sure I've helped matters.
Thank you, Adam. There is one more question about kosher wine, which is Kathy's asked is about, can you explain specifically what kosher for Passover means in terms of the winemaking?
Just that you're not allowed to have any grains or grain products in the winery during the winemaking. And all kosher wineries are also kosher for Passover because it's not worth their while to do one thing without the other. So it just means that no workers have taken their sandwich in to eat their lunch during the winemaking in the winemaking part of the winery. It's on the back label for every kosher wine, it will say kosher and kosher for Passover. During Passover, sorry, I should say, I'm assuming during Passover, we don't eat bread. So we eat matzah, which is an unleavened bread, a bread that's not risen. So during the days of Passover, we're not meant to eat bread. So religious Jews will not drink a wine that's come into contact with leavened products. So that's the story. But again, it's complicated. If anyone wants to contact me or Moshé after, I'll give as much information as you need, and probably clearer than I've just given it just now.
Thank you, Adam. I think Kathy's nodding her head, so I think she's pleased with that. Thank you. And we're moving on from Claire Mumford, who's asked about, are the Negev vines trellised for the ease of irrigation, as you would expect bush vines in arid areas?
Yeah, I think again, Adam can contribute here, but it's probably because it's the easiest way to organize a vineyard. The bush vine is not an easy system to start in a new vineyard, and with irrigation, it's a nightmare. So the irrigation option, some other areas of Israel that could take bush vines, I know that Zeev dreams about it because he loves the Rhone, but he probably has the precipitation to in the Jerusalem hills. There's no problem with that. So, but in the Negev, yeah, you have to have drip irrigation. So it's not a no-go unless somebody really want to make it for a bit of a show. Am I right, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, drip feed irrigation is something Israelis gave to the world. It's an Israeli invention. And it was invented in the 60s, and now you can go in agriculture all over the world and find this drip feed irrigation. Most of the new vineyards in Israel are VSP, but most of you can find some old vine, Carignan and Petit Syrah, with old bush vines, and more wineries are trying to dry farm these days. But mainly they're trellised, they're usually VSP, but some of the older vineyards are still bush vines, goblet bush vines.
Thank you. Could you put, Meg has asked, Moshé, if you could put in the names of the artisan winemakers into the chat? She can't get them.
Yeah, I'll, do you want me to email individuals with because I can add to the list a bit more.
If you send it to me, and I can then just forward it on to all the people that are here today.
Yeah, so I think that's a big as a discovery, for somebody that never tasted Israeli wine. I'd recommend to taste what's available near you, or to go online and actually order something online. And you're most likely to find in the UK this through the kosher importers, things like Domaine du Castello, Terroir, and wines like that. But the small ones, yeah, you have to visit Israel. Some of them do export on a very sporadic kind of basis. But if you visit, definitely I'd say try to visit these guys, because they are, in many cases, producing excellent wines. I think the fact that some of them have very little formal training is actually a testament to the technical ability and in many ways, kind of internal collegiality, because there's a lot of cooperation between them. There's sharing knowledge. There's some now really good faculties that teach winemaking on very short, some of them very short, like intro, and people do courses that are months long, get a certificate, but that gives them really good, there is actually a course now in Israel to how to start a small garage kind of production, but the quality is really good. And a lot of them are making, one that I didn't include here, for instance, just come to mind now is a winery called Nahmani that won, I think it's a platinum, Adam, am I right? In the latest Decanter Wine World Awards for one of the reds. And it's a tiny winery in the Lower Galilee.
They got a platinum medal for what medals are worth. They got a platinum medal in the Decanter World Wine Awards, and they got 97 points. And it's a winery so small that I barely heard of it beforehand. So it's so there's you scratch the surface in Israel, and there's a lot of interesting things going on. And even someone who's meant to be au fait with what's going on there is you can be surprised. So that was last year in the Decanter World Wine Awards, 97 points in a platinum for a winery that I barely heard of.
Yeah, it's somebody that abandoned whatever career, and his daughter is working with him, and they have one of these wineries that overlook a beautiful valley, and it's I think they buy their grapes. I don't think they grow, but they buy Galilee grapes, if I remember well, from the higher Galilee. And the one thing that I want to compare Israel, maybe I should have said it much earlier in the presentation, is that it's a bit like Switzerland. It's small production, but vast majority of the wine stays in the country. It's unfortunate in many ways for PR and prestige, and obviously for income as well. But it's not easy to see a way of, let's say, getting towards 10,000 hectares. That would be a dream. But and will allow for the industry to create maybe something like you can see in Greece now, that it's so beautifully organized, famous and organized and showing all over the world, and markets are now open to them. So Israel is still producing majority of wines is kosher, and if it leaves the country, it's mainly aimed to the kosher market. So unless you're actively seeking, you're not likely to see it still in 2022 on wine lists. And it comes drips and drabs, but it's not yet happening. And I think it's the same problem that Switzerland has. That they love their wines, they produce enough for themselves, and very little of it is. They not seem to be very fast about winning markets world. People do want to export, of course, and the ones that do want to export. But and some wineries have a very successful export program. But for the vast majority, it's a local market.
I think there's one last question here, Moshé, from Malcolm Franks. He's asking what percentage of the wines are mefujal these days, which I believe is boiled or.
Oh, again, I would say it's a small, within the kosher market, it would be probably a small percentage. I don't have the answer straight away, but I think for some sectors within Israel, it's important. I think for mevushal, it means pasteurized, by the way. So there is a level of or method of making wine kosher by pasteurizing it. And again, I don't know when it's originating or where it's originating from, how many years ago. It was written probably in a decree somewhere that to get Adam has something to say about that.
Yeah, I just want to say that we don't want people to leave from here thinking that kosher wine is pasteurized. It's nothing to do with making a wine kosher. You make a wine kosher for the reasons that we said. However, in the United States, to sell caterers and to sell in kosher restaurants, they demand that the wine is pasteurized, which means if the wine is opened by someone non-religious, then it stays kosher. So it doesn't make the wine kosher. So a lot of wineries make like a private label for the mainly for the American market, where they make the wine mevushal, which is today flash pasteurization. But in the meaning of the word mevushal, levashel, is to cook. In the old days, it used to be cooked. So you get a lot of big wineries like Barkan and Carmel making flash pasteurized wine to satisfy this need, like an own label. But I can assure you that most of the wines, Israeli wines, are not flash pasteurized. And certainly all the best wines in Israel are not flash pasteurized. So it's a quirk. They use flash pasteurization in a very modern way. So it doesn't affect the grapes, doesn't affect the wine like it did in the olden days when they literally used to boil it. It's a tiny part of the business, and it's got nothing to do with making the wine kosher or not. The same, you know, the handling rules and the ingredients rule apply. It just keeps the wine kosher if it's already kosher for the ultra-Orthodox or religious market that wants to eat in restaurants, or they've got catering for a bar mitzvah or something. So this is the reason we have this wine, and we have to, you know, every time we explain about kosher, we have to remember that what we call the sacramental wines or the Kiddush wines that we mentioned earlier, and the mevushal wines are a tiny part and nothing to do with the production of table wines. You know, producing a table wine, we use the same Cabernet Sauvignon, a vineyard trained in the same way, state-of-the-art equipment in the winery, a winemaker who studied at Davis or somewhere like everyone else. The wine's aged the same way, bottled the same way. So kosher winemaking is the same as normal winemaking, and that's why you can get some kosher wines that win a lot of third-party recognition. Yeah, it's not a bad wine because it's kosher. It's a bad wine because it's badly made. But you can get some kosher wines that win a lot of awards, and the kosher aspect is written in small in the back label for people that need it. But at the end, as far as Israel's concerned, we're talking about Israel, Eastern Mediterranean wines, not Jewish kosher wines. and we shouldn't confuse kosher or mevushal or sacramental wines with the table wines that are coming out of Israel. Just wanted to make that absolutely clear.
Thank you, Adam.
Sorry.
And the other point that, well, one last question from Judy O'Kane, who was asking about the domestic consumption from her kibbutz days in the late 90s. She said there wasn't really much interest in wine when she was there.
Yeah, well, it's the consumption, I think, average is just over 4 liters per capita per year, which is tiny. It needs to grow. It's in the 90s, I'm not sure what it was. It probably wasn't that much different, actually. But in the 90s, late 90s, maybe on a kibbutz in rural Israel, there was not much wine, but there was already wine making its way in. I lived in Tel Aviv in the early 90s, and I remember actually the first vintages of Terroir and Domaine du Castel, and it was exciting. But again, Tel Aviv is not a good comparison because it is like a state within a state. It's a very gastronomically, culinary speaking, the leading force in the country. I will, if I start, I'll take another 20 minutes to tell you how great a city that is. If you never visited, or if you visited last Judy in 1997, go again. Trust me, it will be worth your while. Tel Aviv is a great gastronomic destination on other levels too, art and architecture, etc. The sea, the promenade, but on food and wine, it's really, I know I'm biased, but it's unique. The vibe is just out of this world. Jerusalem as well has its own wine and food scene that is slightly, well, different, because the two are very kind of different in mentality. But in the 90s, yes, I understand if all you saw maybe was pretty simple wines, or maybe Gold Maccabi or Gold Star beer, and that was the Israeli beers. But no, it's changed a lot. But they need to drink a little bit more, in my view.
We just made one quick note about she's seen a great review of a newly published, self-published guide to Israeli wines on Janssens' site. Do you know? Oh
yes, last week. Yes. The guide, again, had I been at home as I was planned, I'll probably lift it off my desk now. But it's an excellent guidebook to. Here Adam has it.
Adam has it.
And it's half the book is in Hebrew, half in English, and a guide to all the wineries. I don't know if there's any distribution, maybe on Amazon, but it will come from Israel, I'm pretty sure, for authors to that guide. And it's brilliant because it has a good section on, and I think Tam touched on that. Yeah, Tal, thank you. Yeah, I'm the only one without a book here. And the thing is, there's really good gastronomy recommendations. So food stops even in the desert. Yeah, I'm saying even in the desert. The desert actually is very, very lively. It might be sparse, but there's loads of points of interest to stop for not just food and wine, but other activities. So there you go.
I think that's all.
There you go. IsraelAdventure.wine. Yeah.
That's absolutely great, Moshé. Thank you very much indeed. I think you've whetted our palates, both for the wines and to go to Israel as well. It's clearly so much has changed. So thank you very much indeed for giving us this excellent presentation. And now go put your feet up and take life easy and get over COVID. Thank you.